With Max Verstappen now seeming bored of Formula 1 after his 2025 campaign hasn't been up to his standards, so I thought, what if Max Verstappen was never even a part of the Red Bull family and started his F1 career with a completely different team? Would he be as successful as he is now? Which teams would he join later? And could we make him the greatest champion ever over the entire F1 25 career mode? So for season 1, which would be 2026 in real life, we had some pretty interesting driver moves, firstly starting with Hamilton leaving Ferrari after it didn't go so well for him and joined Aston Martin. We then saw the return of Jack Doohan to replace Alonso, who is now retiring at the age of 94. But most importantly, where did Max Verstappen go for the start of our career? And it was Alpine. I felt Alpine was the suitable start for Max, which have a rich history of also bringing juniors through to F1, but this also meant the fastest man on the grid, Lance Stroll, joined Red Bull to replace us. Red Bull have now gone from a pretty mid driver to now the greatest driver on the grid in one of the best cars. This season is finished. But our season at Alpine started pretty solid as we were competing with Gasly at the start of the season, with us outperforming him some races and him doing the same to us. But for our first year and at a new team against a very experienced driver, I would very much take that. And not long later in the season, we actually got our first podium ever, ironically at the Red Bull Ring. The guys leading the top of the table were interestingly Leclerc and Ferrari, who were dominating the sport for the start of season 1. But as the season went on, our performances started to get worse and worse, which should be the complete opposite as we were getting used to driving in Formula 1. But as the car initially was to our liking, the car seemed to go more Gasly's direction and in turn took a massive dip in performance. As we got to the last couple of races, Leclerc ended up winning his first championship and Ferrari's in a long time, but our performances not improving, I became pretty unhappy with Alpine. As the season ended and we dropped to 5th in the Constructors, but just beating Gasly in the head-to-head, I did however make the decision to part ways with the team, as I lost all faith within that second half of the season and then favouring Gasly over me. But which team would snatch up one of the greatest talents for season 2? And the team which did was Aston Martin, a team which was decent in car development and favoured me to be the team leader, as Lewis Hamilton decided to retire from the sport this season, meant I was teammates with Jack Doohan for season 2. We also had Ocon leaving Haas after a falling out, and he went back to his old team in Alpine to replace us, and Paul Aron then came in to join Haas. For season 2, it was a start of dreams with Aston Martin, as the car on paper wasn't the best, but we really gelled with the car as we were getting podium after podium and really dominating Doohan, as on average he was over a second off each weekend. We then got to Canada in tricky conditions and got our first ever pole position, and then later claimed our first ever win, with also Paul Aron getting his first podium in the Haas. It really was a surprising and amazing start to the season, and something I wouldn't think would have happened, and that success kept going as we got more podiums and another win at Austria. We were actually leading the championship, which was absolutely mental to say we didn't have the best car. But unfortunately, as the season went on, and a big weakness in the car, which was the straight line speed, a poor weekend at Monza and Baku, known for their long straights, drastically reduced our gap at the top after a disaster at Baku, and for the only time Jack Doohan actually beating us in the race. We were also in a state of two minds as there were a regulation change at the end of the season, and wanting to save our resources for next season, we then made the decision to halt any more upgrades on the car and focus on next year's. An okay race at Mexico and Leclerc having a disaster that weekend meant he was out of the championship fight, and it was just between us and Lando going into Abu Dhabi, with the gap being just at 9 points meant if Lando won and we finished lower than 3rd, we would lose the championship. But at the final race and in the last moments of qualifying, we managed to grab pole position once again, just in front of Lando and Sainz. But for the race, it was a close battle with them both. Any mistake meant we would lose the championship. But on the last lap, Sainz did overtake us for the lead, but as Lando was still behind, meant we managed to grab our first ever World Championship, and in a car which really shouldn't have. A really big surprise I would have never thought of at the start of the season. We ended season 2 as a champion. We unfortunately finished 3rd in the Constructors thanks to Doohan and beat him 6-0 in the head-to-head, and of course I decided to stay with Aston Martin for season 3, but would the new regulations play a part in our performance. And for the start of Season 3, we had a couple of driver moves, with firstly Gasly, our old teammate, getting the axe from Alpine as Ocon fully dominated him last season, in which Zane Maloney then replaced him. We also had Hülkenberg retire and O'Sullivan replace him at Sauber. But unfortunately, no news from Aston Martin, as Jack Doohan continued to be our teammate. But for the new regulations, we did make the right decision in saving resources, as we were at the top of development for Season 3 and surely would be another good chance to defend our title. And we exactly did that with utter dominance at the start of the season. Pole after win at each race and not being off the podium. The championship gap was just extended with no real challenge. We also had Doohan having the odd good result, which was good for the team and our fight in the constructors. We eventually got near to the end of the season and to Baku, and this was actually the weekend we could win our second championship, as we were that far ahead. And after an okay qualifying and mighty fight with Piastri to try stop us, but in the end it wasn't enough, and we took our second World Championship in just our third season. This was prime Aston Martin and Max Verstappen, just utter dominance for Season 3. But our fight wasn't over, as we still had to fight for the first constructors and also another big regulation change for next season. But we did play the big IQ move earlier in this season and halted all development on the car, as we were that far ahead. But we eventually got to the final round, and with a close battle with McLaren for the constructors, it was unfortunately just not enough, and we finished in second, no thanks to Doohan. But it did, to be fair, improve this season, but it just wasn't enough for me. This could really hurt us for the future, as we need both drivers to really develop the car. But in the end, it was a great season with 6 poles, 9 wins, and also gathering our second World Championship. For Season 4, like last season, it was about defending our title, but I wanted to bring the team to the front as well. We can't keep letting Doohan finish way behind and halt our development forward, as it's not a sustainable way to go, as we have seen with Red Bull in real life. But before we get into the season, we had just one driver transfer, and it was for Kimi Antonelli being fired from Mercedes and being replaced by Pierre Gasly, which is fair enough. Kimi hasn't really shown much in the sport since his arrival, but maybe a potential for a team to snatch him up in the future. As we got into the season, it was rather surprising, as the car was top of development once again, and I really wanted Doohan to step up his performances, and he really did, even actually better than us. He got his first podium, then later his first pole and win, and above us in the standings, as we had a rather mediocre start to the season and a bit of a hangover from last year. But this wasn't uncontested, as the McLaren looked extremely fast in the hands of Lando for this season. As we got to Canada and the mid part of the season, we eventually managed to find our mojo and score a couple of wins and at our home race, as well as a few more podiums, but Lando was still the guy to beat. And although Doohan was driving like prime Michael Schumacher in the early part of the season, his performances did start to dip and go back into his old ways, and because of this dip, the team also started to take a heavy hit with car performance later into the season, which I was extremely unhappy with, as I wanted to compete for the title and also the constructors. But as we got closer to the end of the season, we were just trying to be as consistent at this point. Unfortunately for us, Lando did start to bottle the championship, with a couple of poor finishes meant coming into the final race we were leading the championship by 11 points. But this championship was made a lot harder because of the car's performance and Doohan not bringing any progressive upgrades in the season. This frustration in turn decided me to go into talks with Mercedes, as they started to bring a lot of momentum into the season, and we were also hitting our potential with development. But Abu Dhabi finally came, and we performed when it mattered in qualifying to take pole quite comfortably. Then after a very tense race, battling for the win with Lando, in which he did overtake us, but we came across the line in second, and it was enough to take our third World Championship by just 4 points in the end. 4 seasons and 3 championships is a start of an F1 career anyone could have dreamed of. But the contract talks eventually came after the celebrations, and after finishing second in the constructors once again, that is when I made my decision for Season 5 if I would stay with Aston Martin. Season 5 eventually came, and as you can see, we made the move to Mercedes. I saw potential in them last season, and although the car isn't the best at the moment, I believe it can be later on in the season and be better than Aston Martin. But for season 5, Aston Martin took a massive change in direction with their driver lineup, with getting rid of Doohan as soon as we left, which is pretty annoying. Their new driver lineup was actually ex-Mercedes drivers of Pierre Gasly and Kimi Antonelli, which meant of course we partnered George for the season. And there was one last move, and it was Carlos Sainz retiring from the sport and our old friend of Doohan replacing him at Williams. Good luck to them. But the season started okay as we didn't have the fastest car. However, Aston Martin looked rather good, with having a lot of success, particularly with Kimi, and winning a lot of early races. Me and George were a solid pairing and scoring good points most races and trading who was in front each weekend, with us just edging him out. We had some success at Canada, getting the pole and win, and George winning the weekend after at Austria. We were sitting in a solid third in the constructors for the mid part of the season. However, due to our recognition not being so high with the team yet, we could not do a lot of the upgrades to the car, so we spent a lot of time with no developments, which was pretty annoying. Whilst we were waiting and collecting decent points, Kimi continued his success and leading the championship, but eventually just before our home race at round 7, we managed to collect enough recognition to start a few major upgrades in the hopes for the end of the season push. And that late season push did come, but it was unfortunately a little too late. I managed to grab a win and pole at the end of the season, but the title decider was between Lando and Kimi, in which I got the pole, but as the race started and then both actually coming together, with Kimi dropping to last and Lando needing the win, despite being a bit jealous of Aston Martin's performance, I did hold on and didn't give Lando the win, which meant Kimi won his first World Championship with Aston Martin, but as usual, they still finished second in the constructors. In the end, it wasn't the best season, and I was pretty gutted about Aston Martin's success, but the momentum we had and us just edging George out in the head-to-head showed some good promise for season 6. And season 6 started pretty boring as we had no driver moves for the year. Thank you so much, EA. So I guess our focus will go to car development and what it looks like after the new regulations. And we did a really good job with saving a lot of parts, and we were actually leading the way. Aston Martin had a drop off, which I did predict would happen as they were very much near their potential. Ferrari seemed to have gone massively backwards, and RB had a pretty good car for the season as well. For the start of the year, we were back to our normal ways of winning races and getting podiums. Our battle was mostly with the McLarens, and as the season went on, for whatever reason, George's form started to dip, and our fight for the constructors was going to be a hard one despite having the best car. We managed to have a good gap to Norris in the Drivers' Championship in the mid part of the season, just being as consistent as possible, whilst Aston Martin and Kimi started to show glimpses of pace and a resurgence. But as we got to Italy and Baku, George's form did start to come back, which was great and will hopefully keep the team at the front. For Baku, we started really well on pole, but having a major crash with Lando, which resulted in Oscar also crashing, and then us later dumping it into the wall with no front wing, which meant me, Oscar and Lando all got 0 points for the weekend, with Stroll and Colapinto getting a podium. The gap was still 32 points in our favour between 3 cars going into the final 2 rounds, which meant we could still win it going into round 9 of Mexico. And the weekend started okay, qualifying in P4 thanks to the late rain in the session, then getting off to a good start battling both George and Kimi for the win, but Kimi just seemed to have too much pace for us for the win in the end, but it was still enough to be crowned a 4-time world champion and first for Mercedes. We have now equalled what Max has won in real life in just our 6th season, and eventually to the final race. It was a very close battle with McLaren for the constructors still, but after an intense 4-way battle between both teams, we ended up winning the race and the constructors for Mercedes, fully doing the double for the season, our best season yet, and I wonder what more is to come for the final few seasons. We are now coming to the final few seasons of replaying Max's entire career, and season 7, it started with a somewhat boring driver transfer market, with just one of Bortoleto being fired from Sauber and replaced by Josep Marte. But for car development, Mercedes led the way, followed closely by Aston Martin, but as you can see, we were very near our peak performance with not many upgrades left, so there wouldn't be much development for this season. As the year started, it was a battle between both top teams of Mercedes and Aston Martin, as McLaren seemed to dropped off massively. It was a very close beginning at the end of the season, all 4 drivers usually taking all 4 top spots each weekend. We managed to have success at Canada, Austria and Silverstone to give ourselves a healthy gap at the top, followed by George, but also Kimi doing a shift to have some really good results and still be in the championship. As the season went on, we felt it was best just to hold all upgrades, as there were no need to develop the car further, and there was another regulation change for next season, so it would be super important to save resources, but I also wasn't sure if I would be with the team for next season, as I did want a change and there was one team calling for me still. But the season came near to the end, and after another super consistent year, not finishing lower than 3rd, and at Vegas we lifted our 5th World Championship, followed by Russell in the standings. It was another dominant year from us, and also from the team winning the Constructors for a 2nd time in a row. After Abu Dhabi finally closed off an amazing season and completing everything I really wanted to in Max's career, I then made the decision if I would be with the team for the final 2 seasons. And for the start of season 8, the penultimate season, and I decided to make the drastic move to Ferrari. It doesn't make sense in terms of winning championships as of yet, but you can't finish off your Formula 1 career without driving for Ferrari. And although they didn't have the best car for season 8, this year will be a building year with lots of resources at hand, and hopefully we can go for the championship for our final season, but let's see what we can do for this year. For driver moves, we of course replaced Colapinto at Ferrari, which means the greatest rivalry in Formula 1 will happen, with Charles Leclerc as our teammate. Franco decided to go back to Alpine to replace Ocon, who retired from the sport, and to replace us at Mercedes was Bortoleto making his return. But as I said earlier, the car wasn't going to be the best for the start of the season, and we were just collecting solid points as a team and understanding where we can improve this car, grabbing the odd podium here or there, but Aston Martin looked great this year, especially with Kimi, who will be the title favourite. As the season went on, we made a few big upgrades to the car to try and bring it forward and see if we can have a late push in the championship. But after the upgrades came, the car still wasn't at the likes of Mercedes or Aston Martin, so that's when I made the decision to basically stop all upgrades for the season and focus fully for next year and save all our resources. It was a really close battle at the top, as Vegas, one race before the end, Kimi did take his 2nd World Championship for Aston Martin, and they also won the Constructors. Finally, after how many years? But I do think for next year, these will be our biggest rivals. In the end, the season was just a growing year for us and for Ferrari. It was a very close battle with Leclerc this season, getting the exact same points, which I think for the final season will be our hardest title fight yet, and if we have the car. Now, it is the final season, and you might be wondering why, because career mode is 10 seasons long. The reason is, in order for Max to join a team for the first season, you first have to skip a season, and then you get the contract negotiations at the end. But let's go into the final season and our final chance of claiming a 6th title, and one with Ferrari. Firstly, starting with driver moves for the final season, and it is a big one, with Lando Norris leaving McLaren and joining Red Bull. He spent all this time being a one-team driver and then just decides to leave at the very last moment, which caused an even sadder driver move, and one I don't think the sport would ever recover from, which is Lance Stroll deciding to retire from Formula 1. Thank God it was the last season, as there was no one who could do it better and will be greatly missed. This left one seat open at McLaren, and the somewhat young driver now of Jack Crawford to take Lando's position. Fortunately, our patience paid off, as last season, just being a building season for the team, really worked, as we were top of car development, followed closely by Mercedes, which should give us the best chance to take our final title, and one with Ferrari. And the season started pretty well with the team, taking a win at the first round, then a really close battle with Charles at Bahrain, in which he did take the win. It was a very close season between us two, and not much to separate us, and this carried on for all of it. Both of us getting caught out a few times because of the weather in qualifying meant some mixed results, but eventually being tied points coming into the final 2 rounds really showed this rivalry was super close. At Vegas, Charles took the upper hand going into the final race after some dirty tactics and damaging our front wing in the race. He led the championship by just 3 points, but when it mattered at Abu Dhabi, we started second, almost a second ahead of Charles after a disastrous qualifying from him. The race, however, was really tense, as although he had a low position, he clawed his way up pretty fast and we couldn't afford to be less than 3 points ahead. We needed to be at least 2 positions in front of him, whilst we was in a tense battle with Bortoleto and Crawford, with him being just behind. But in the end, we hung on to take our first World Championship with Ferrari, and 6th of all time. This just feels like winning our first title with such a special team. And eventually, that was it. We had 3 different world champions over 9 seasons of Max, Charles and Kimi, with Charles claiming 1, Kimi with 2 and Max with 6. We also had 3 constructor titles, 23 wins, 23 poles and 62 podiums in what I would say was a very successful career for Max Verstappen.